You don't tell me where to sit, Deacon Holloway snarled, reaching for the young woman's wrist. You work for me. Watch your hands, Marlowe said quietly. He didn't listen. His palm cracked across a stranger's cheek before anyone could move, and the whole bar went silent. Then Marlowe moved. One step, one twist of the wrist, one shove between the shoulder blades, and 200 pounds of arrogance hit the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Nobody in that bar knew who she really was. Not yet, but somewhere, 300 miles away, a man watched the video of that takedown and went pale, because he recognized that exact move. He'd seen it once before 15 years ago, from a friend he thought he'd buried, along with the truth, forever. Her name wasn't just a bartender's name, and the past she thought she'd left behind was about to come looking for her, one slap at a time. He slapped the wrong woman in a bar. She dropped him instantly, like a Navy SEAL strike. Part 1. The slap heard around Cedar Hollow. The town of Cedar Hollow woke up the same way it had for 40 years. Slow, quiet, smelling like pine smoke and wet gravel. Nobody in Cedar Hollow expected anything to change. That was the whole point of living there. Change happened to other towns. Bigger towns. Towns with highways running through them instead of around them. Marlowe Ashcroft had chosen Cedar Hollow for exactly that reason. She unlocked the front door of the Rusty Anchor at 5:40 in the morning. Not because the bar opened early. It didn't open until 11. She unlocked it because 5:40 was when her body woke up, whether she wanted it to or not. Some habits didn't ask permission. They just showed up. Like an old friend who never learned to knock, she stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds, scanning. Left to right, habit, then right to left because you check twice. Because once is how people get killed. She didn't think the words anymore. She just did the motion. Muscle memory doesn't retire just because you do. Inside, the bar smelled like last night's whiskey and this morning's silence. She flipped the chairs down off the tables one by one, wiped the counter that didn't need wiping, checked the register, checked the back door, checked the lock on the back door twice, because twice. Her hands moved fast around the bottles behind the bar. Fast and exact. No wasted motion. She could have told you the count of every liquor bottle on that shelf without looking. 91. She always knew. Numbers had a way of sticking to her, the way they stick to people who were trained to notice things other people walked right past. She wasn't supposed to notice things anymore. That was the deal she made with herself 3 years ago. Watch nothing, track nothing, just pour drinks and smile, and let the days blur together like watercolor left out in the rain. Except her eyes still swept every doorway. Except her ears still counted footsteps before she saw the person attached to them. Except some mornings she woke up at 3 a.m., with her hand already reaching for a weapon that wasn't there anymore. Because it was never there anymore. Because that life was over. She told herself that every day. Over. Done. Buried. She just hadn't figured out how to make her body believe it. By 10:30, sunlight was cutting long gold lines across the wooden floor of the Rusty Anchor. Marlowe stood behind the bar, polishing a glass she'd already polished twice, watching the light move the way she used to watch a target area, waiting for something to shift. Something small. Something wrong. Nothing was wrong. That was Cedar Hollow for you. Nothing was ever wrong, which was exactly why she picked it. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from her ex-neighbor, Ruth Ann, who ran the diner 2 doors down. Storm's coming in tonight. Bad one. You got enough candles? Marlowe smiled despite herself. Small towns. Everybody watching the sky for everybody else. She typed back. Always do. She did. 6 candles. 2 flashlights. A battery radio she never used but kept charged anyway. Preparation wasn't paranoia. It was just what happened when a person spent a decade learning that comfort was borrowed time. At 11, she flipped the sign. Open. The regulars trickled in through the afternoon the way they always did. Harlan Voss, retired railroad man, who ordered the same beer every single day and complained about the same ache in his knee every single day. Odette Marsh, who ran the flower shop and always tipped in exact change because she said it kept her honest. A handful of truckers passing through on the interstate. stopping because the rusty anchor had the only decent burger for 40 miles. Marlowe moved through the afternoon on autopilot. Pour, wipe, listen, nod, laugh when the joke called for it. Not because she didn't care. She did care, in her own quiet way. But there was a version of her that lived behind glass now, watching herself be normal from somewhere just outside her own skin. Because normal was armor, and she wore it well, until the door opened at 9:15 that night, and everything she'd built in 3 years of careful, deliberate nothing started coming apart in less than 60 seconds. The rusty anchor was crowded by then. Friday night crowded. Music low on the jukebox. Some old country song about a woman leaving a man who deserved to be left. Laughter at the pool table. A group of women near the window celebrating somebody's birthday with a cake Marlowe had let them bring in, even though it violated 3 different health codes she'd decided not to think about. And then the door opened, and the air in the room changed. Marlowe felt it before she saw him. A shift. A pressure drop. The kind of thing you feel in your chest before you understand why. Deacon Holloway walked in like he owned the floor beneath his boots. Because in a way, he did. His family owned half the buildings in Cedar Hollow, including the one the rusty anchor sat inside of. He was maybe 30, handsome in the way that money makes a man handsome, whether or not the face underneath deserves it. He was already drunk. Not stumbling drunk. Worse. The kind of drunk that made a man mean and convinced of his own charm at the exact same time. He ordered a whiskey, then another, then a third, before Marlowe had even finished pouring the second. She watched him the way she watched everyone. Quietly, without seeming to. By his 4th drink, Deacon had drifted toward the birthday group by the window. Loud. Leaning too close. Saying things that made the younger women in the group go stiff and quiet, the particular stillness women get when they're trying to make themselves small enough to be left alone. Marlowe's jaw tightened. She came around the bar, slow, casual. The way you approach something you don't want to spook. Deacon. Her voice was even. Flat, almost. Why don't you come sit at the bar? I'll get you some water. He turned. Looked her up and down in a way that made her skin want to crawl straight off her bones. I'm fine right here, sweetheart. Wasn't a question. Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Nobody talked to him like that in this town. Not to his face. Not when his last name opened every door and closed every mouth. You don't tell me where to sit, he said. You work for me. This whole building. My family's. You know that? I know. So maybe you ought to remember who's in charge here. Marlowe didn't answer. She just held out her hand toward the bar, an invitation and a boundary at the same time. He didn't take it. Instead, he turned back toward the group of women. Toward one in particular, young, dark-haired, maybe 22, wearing a paper birthday crown that had slid sideways on her head. She'd been trying to laugh him off for the last 10 minutes. Politely. The way women learn to do from the time they're girls. Laughing at things that aren't funny. Because laughing feels safer than saying no. Come on, Deacon said, reaching for her wrist. Dance with me. I'm okay, she said, quiet. Firm enough. Not firm enough for a man that far gone. I said dance with me. She said she's okay. Marlowe's voice cut clean through the noise of the jukebox. Deacon spun toward her, and in that half second, the whole bar seemed to hold its breath, the way rooms do right before something breaks. You keep opening your mouth, he said, and I swear to God. Watch your hands, Marlowe said. He didn't watch anything. His palm came around fast, faster than a man that drunk should have been able to move. It cracked across the young woman's cheek before she could even flinch away, the sound of it slicing through the music like a gunshot in church. The room froze. For one full second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The birthday crown tipped off the woman's head and hit the floor, and the sound of that plastic crown clattering against wood was somehow louder than the slap itself. And then Marlowe moved. Not the way a bartender moves when she's breaking up a fight. Not the clumsy shove and shout of someone who's never had to actually put a man down before. She moved the way she'd been trained to move 11 years ago, in a place far from Cedar Hollow, under people whose names she wasn't allowed to say out loud anymore. One step. Wait forward. Because you close distance before he can reset. Her hand caught Deacon's wrist mid-motion, twisting it up and back in a single fluid arc that took his whole arm with it. He yelped, off balance, stumbling into a spin he didn't choose, which put his back exactly where she wanted it, which was the whole point. Her palm hit the center of his shoulder blades. Not hard, not soft either. Precise. Calculated to the exact amount of force required to put 180 pounds of drunk arrogance face first onto a barroom floor without breaking anything that mattered. He went down like a puppet with the strings cut. The whole room stood in stunned silence, Deacon groaning on the floorboards, his nose an inch from a peanut shell somebody had dropped an hour earlier. Marlowe stood over him, chest steady, breath even. Her hands weren't even shaking, which was strange, because for 3 years she'd told herself she'd forgotten how to do that. How to become that. How to turn her body into something efficient and dangerous in under 2 seconds. Turns out, you don't forget. You just stop practicing. Get out of my bar, she said, quiet. So quiet it was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse than if she'd screamed it. Deacon rolled onto his back, blinking up at her, blood trickling from where his nose had kissed the floor. His eyes were wide now, not with pain, with something closer to fear, and underneath the fear, confusion. The specific confusion of a man realizing the woman he thought he understood was someone else entirely. "Who the hell are you?" he rasped. Nobody answered him, because nobody in that bar knew. Except somewhere near the back, a phone had already been raised. Already recording. The little red light blinking like an eye that didn't blink. By the time the sheriff's deputy arrived 12 minutes later, the crowd outside the Rusty Anchor had doubled. Word traveled fast in a town of 2,000 people, and video traveled faster. Marlowe stood outside on the porch, arms crossed, watching 2 deputies help a still-dazed Deacon Holloway into the back of a cruiser. Sheriff Nash Corbett approached her slow, hat in hand, the way he approached most things, careful, like he didn't want to startle whatever was standing in front of him. "You want to tell me what happened in there," he said. "He hit a woman." I stopped him. "That's not what I'm asking, Marlowe." She looked at him. "I'm asking," Corbett said, lowering his voice, "how a bartender puts a 200-pound man on the floor in under 2 seconds flat. Because I've been doing this job 18 years. I've seen bar fights. That wasn't a bar fight. That was something else." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "Just adrenaline, Sheriff." He studied her a long moment. The porch light buzzed overhead, throwing pale yellow across both their faces. "Sure," he said finally, not believing it, not pushing either. Sure it was. He walked back toward the cruiser. Marlowe exhaled, long and slow, watching her own breath fog faintly in the cooling night air. Because that's how it starts, isn't it? One crack. One small crack in the wall you spent years building. And you tell yourself it's nothing. Tell yourself nobody noticed. Except somebody always notices. Except the crack never stays small. Which is the whole cruel joke of trying to bury who you used to be. She just didn't know yet how fast that crack was about to become a canyon. By the time she got home that night, her hands had finally started shaking. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, staring at nothing, replaying the last 2 seconds of the fight the way she used to replay every operation afterward, cataloging every movement, every angle, looking for the mistake. There wasn't one. That was the problem. Her body hadn't hesitated, hadn't fumbled, hadn't forgotten a single thing it used to know. 3 years of pretending, and it had all come roaring back the instant it was needed. Clean and sharp and terrifyingly fluent, like a language she thought she'd lost, that turned out to still live somewhere underneath her tongue. She thought about her father then, the way she always did on nights like this, whether she wanted to or not. Desmond Ashcroft, Colonel, Ghost, the man who used to wake her at 5 a.m. on Saturdays to run drills in the woods behind their old house, back when she was 9 years old and thought it was the best game in the world. Watch the wind in the leaves, little wren. Wind tells you everything before it happens. He'd called her that, little wren, small, quick, watching everything from somewhere nobody thought to look. He'd been dead 15 years now. She was 14 when they told her. Training accident, they said. Overseas. A folded flag and a closed casket, and a room full of men in uniform who wouldn't quite meet her eyes. She hadn't questioned it back then. She was 14. What did she know? But she was 29 now. And something about tonight, about the way her hands had moved, without her permission, about the ghost of her father's training rising up out of her like smoke from a fire, she thought had gone cold. Something about it made her think of him different than she had in years. Like maybe some part of her had been waiting. For what? She didn't know. She didn't sleep much that night. She didn't need the phone to tell her the video had gone viral by morning. She could feel it the second she stepped outside, the way people's eyes caught on her half a second too long, the way conversations stopped and started again when she walked past. Ruth Ann caught her outside the diner at 8, phone already in hand, screen already turned toward Marlowe's face. "Girl," Ruth Ann said, breathless, "do you have any idea how many people have watched this?" Marlowe looked at the screen, a grainy, shaky video. Herself, moving in that same clean, terrible arc, Deacon hitting the floor, the caption above it in bold white letters. She dropped him like a Navy SEAL. Marlowe's stomach turned over. 800,000 views, Ruth Ann said. Since last night. Marlowe. 800,000, that's not... Marlowe stopped herself, because what was she going to say? That's not what happened. That's not who I am. Except it was exactly what happened. And it was exactly who she used to be, buried under 3 years of quiet mornings and polished glasses, and a name that wasn't the only thing she'd changed about herself. "People are saying you're some kind of secret agent," Ruth Ann went on, delighted, oblivious to the way Marlowe's face had gone pale. "Saying you're former military. Saying..." "It was just adrenaline," Marlowe said. "Too fast. Too flat." Ruth Ann raised an eyebrow, but let it go. The way people in small towns let things go right up until the moment they don't. Marlowe walked the rest of the way to the rusty anchor with her head down, feeling the eyes on her from every window she passed. By the time she reached the bar, her hands were cold despite the warm morning sun. She didn't know yet that 800,000 views was nothing. That by nightfall it would be past 2 million. That somewhere in a glass office 300 miles away, a man named Warwick Halloway would watch that same video on a tablet, his jaw tightening, his mind already working through the particular kind of calculation that men like him were built for. And she didn't know that somewhere further away still, somewhere she hadn't let herself think about in 3 long years, a phone was ringing in an office that didn't officially exist, and a man on the other end of that call was watching the same grainy footage with an entirely different reaction, recognition. Warwick Halloway's office sat on the top floor of the tallest building in the county, glass walls looking out over the timber yards and shipping docks that had made his family's fortune 3 generations running. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, dressed like a man who'd never once in his life had to wonder if his shirt was pressed correctly. His son sat across from him now, an ice pack pressed to his swollen nose, sulking like a boy twice his actual age. "She humiliated me," Deacon said, voice thick and nasal, "in front of the whole town. You need to do something." Warwick didn't look up from the tablet in his hands. He was watching the video for the 4th time, studying it. Not the way a father watches his son get hurt, the way a strategist watches a threat reveal itself.
"Dad, are you even listening? Be quiet, Deacon."
Something in his father's voice made Deacon go still. Warwick set the tablet down slowly. His eyes hadn't left the frozen frame on the screen. Marlowe's hand locked around his son's wrist, her stance perfect, textbook, the kind of movement that didn't come from bartending school. "Where did she come from?" Warwick said. Quiet. To himself as much as to his son. "What does it matter?" "She broke my nose." "It matters," Warwick said, "because I have seen that exact move before." Deacon blinked. "What are you talking about?" Warwick didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the window, looked out over the docks where 3 of his cargo ships sat loading under floodlights, containers stacked high enough to blot out the moon. Because he had seen that move before. 15 years before, to be exact, from a man he'd once called a friend, a man whose name he hadn't said out loud in over a decade, not because he'd forgotten it, but because some names were safer left buried. which meant this woman, this bartender, with the two fast hands and the two steady eyes, was not some random stranger who'd wandered into Cedar Hollow to pour whiskey for truckers, which meant Warwick Holloway had a very large problem. And problems in his experience were best solved before they had the chance to grow teeth. "Find out who she is," Warwick said. "Everything. Where she came from. Who trained her. I want a name by tomorrow. Dad, it's just some bartender who got lucky. Nobody gets that lucky." Warwick turned from the window, and for the first time, Deacon saw something in his father's face he rarely saw there. Not anger, fear, carefully dressed up as calm. "Do it tonight," Warwick said. 300 miles away, in a nondescript building with no sign on the door, a man named Commander Atticus Reeves set down his phone and stared at his laptop screen for a long, long moment. The video had been sent to him by an old colleague, half as a joke. "Look at this bartender," the message said. "Moves like one of ours." Made me think of the old days. Reeve had almost laughed it off. Almost. Except he pressed play a second time, and a third. And by the fourth time, his laughter had died somewhere in his throat, replaced by something colder. Because he recognized that stance, that exact economy of motion, the specific way she'd redirected the larger man's momentum, instead of fighting it, head-on, a technique he had personally drilled into exactly one recruit, more than a decade ago, in a program that had been shut down and sealed, and officially erased from every record that mattered. A recruit whose file had a closed status stamped across it 3 years back. Voluntary separation. Whereabouts unknown. A recruit who had been 14 years old the day her father died under circumstances that Reeve had never fully believed, no matter what the official report said. He sat back in his chair. Somewhere outside his window, rain had started to fall, tapping soft against the glass like fingers asking to be let in. "Well, I'll be damned," Reeve said quietly. "To no one. There you are, little Wren." He picked the phone back up. Dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "I needed a flight to Cedar Hollow," he said. "Tonight, if you can manage it." Back in Cedar Hollow, Marlowe spent the day trying to hold her small, careful world together with both hands, watching it slip through her fingers anyway. The bar was busier than she'd ever seen it. Every stool filled, strangers driving in from towns 40 minutes away just to get a look at the woman from the video. She poured drinks with a smile stretched thin across her face, deflecting question after question with the same 3 answers on rotation. Just adrenaline. Lucky moment. Anybody would have done the same. Nobody believed her. She could see it in their eyes. The way they watched her hands move behind the bar now, searching for some hidden proof of the thing they suspected but couldn't name. By closing time, her jaw ached from smiling. She locked the front door, flipped the sign, and stood alone in the dim quiet of the empty bar, finally letting the smile drop from her face like a mask she'd been holding up with sheer will for 14 straight hours. She poured herself 2 fingers of whiskey. Didn't drink it. Just held the glass, watching the amber liquid catch the low light, listening to the storm Ruth Ann had warned her about finally rolling in outside. Thunder grumbling low across the hills. Because that's when it happened. Because that's always when it happens, isn't it? Right when you think the worst of the day is behind you. The front door handle rattled. Marlowe's whole body went still. "We're closed," she called out, not moving from behind the bar. The handle rattled again. Then a fist knocked. 3 times, slow, deliberate. She set the glass down without a sound. Old instinct pulling her hand toward the small drawer beneath the register, the one that held nothing more dangerous than a box cutter and a roll of quarters. Her fingers hovered there, and for one strange, suspended second, she felt the absence of something else, something heavier, something she hadn't carried in 3 years and suddenly, achingly, wished she still had. "I said we're closed. Marlowe Ashcroft." The voice came muffled through the door, calm, measured, unmistakably male, unmistakably certain. Or should I say, Ashcroft is the name on your lease. Wren was the name we used. Marlowe's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. Because nobody called her that. Nobody in this life, this town, this careful new skin she'd spent 3 years growing over the old one. Nobody except she crossed the floor before she'd fully decided to. Unlocked the door, opened it just enough to see the man standing on her porch in the pouring rain, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing a coat too fine for a town like this one. Water running in rivulets down a face she hadn't seen in 3 long years. "Commander," she whispered. "May I come in?" Atticus Reeves said. "Or would you rather have this conversation out here, where anyone driving by might overhear exactly what I came to say?" Marlowe's hand tightened on the door frame. Behind her, the bar sat dark and quiet, the last safe place she had left in the world, about to stop being safe the second she let this man cross the threshold. She thought of her father. The wind in the leaves. Watch it before it happens. She hadn't watched closely enough. Not this time. This storm had been building for 3 years, and she hadn't even felt the wind change until it was already standing on her porch, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards, waiting to be let in. "Come in," she said finally, because there wasn't really a choice left. There hadn't been one since the moment her hand closed around Deacon Holloway's wrist and her body remembered exactly who she used to be. Reeves stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. He looked around the small, quiet bar with an expression Marlowe couldn't quite read, something between pity and pride. "Cedar Hollow," he said. "Wren, of all the places to disappear. A bar. Truly. Don't call me that. It's who you are. It's who I was." Reeves' eyes settled on her, steady, unblinking, the same look he used to give her across a briefing table a lifetime ago. Is. Funny how those words stop meaning much once your body remembers what your mouth's been denying for 3 years. "I watched the video, Marlowe. So did roughly 4 million other people by this point, and climbing. So has, I imagine, at least one person in this town who has every reason to want to know exactly who you really are, and exactly what you know." Marlowe's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Reeve reached into his coat, pulled out a small folded photograph, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. He set it on the bar between them. Marlowe looked down. Her breath left her body in one long, silent exhale. It was her father, younger than she remembered him, standing beside another man she didn't recognize at first, until she did. Until the shape of the jaw and the particular arrogance in the posture clicked into place, with a name she'd heard exactly one time that same day, spat out in fear by his own drunk son on her barroom floor. Warwick Holloway, standing beside her father, smiling, like friends do. "Your father didn't die in a training accident overseas," Reeves said quietly. "I've known that for 15 years and said nothing because saying something would have gotten a 14-year-old girl killed alongside the truth. But you're not 14 anymore, Wren. And that video is already out there. And men far more dangerous than my old colleagues have already started asking questions about the woman who moves like a ghost from a program that officially never existed." Thunder rolled outside, rattling the windows of the rusty anchor. Marlowe stared down at the photograph, at her father's smiling, long-dead face, at the man standing beside him whose son she had put on the floor less than 24 hours earlier without knowing a single thing about the storm she was about to walk straight into. "Tell me," she said, voice low, steady in a way that surprised even her. "Tell me everything, right now." Reeve looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the stool across from her and sat down, the rain still dripping off his coat and pooling dark on the wooden floor. "It started," he said, "the same year your father died. And it never really stopped." Outside, the storm broke fully open over Cedar Hollow, rain hammering the roof of the little bar where a woman who used to be called Wren sat listening to the first true words anyone had spoken to her in 3 years. The careful, quiet life she'd built around herself finally, irreversibly coming apart at every seam. She didn't know yet how far this would go. Didn't know about her sister, waiting in a life of her own 2 states away, with a box of their father's things she'd never once opened. Didn't know about the man still buried in a shallow grave of lies, who wasn't dead at all. Didn't know that Warwick Holloway was, at that very moment, standing in his glass office above the docks, staring at the same old photograph from a different angle, making the first calls that would put Marlowe Ashcroft's whole world directly in his crosshairs. She only knew one thing for certain. sitting there in the storm-lit dark of her own bar, her father's ghost staring up at her from a photograph 15 years too late. Wren was awake, and this time she wasn't going back to sleep. Part 2. The ghosts we don't bury. Rain kept falling on Cedar Hollow long after Commander Atticus Reeve finished the first part of his story. Long after the whiskey Marlowe never drank went warm and flat on the bar between them. Long after the thunder rolled off into the hills and left only the sound of water dripping steady off the eaves, tapping out a rhythm like something counting down. Marlowe hadn't moved in almost 20 minutes. She just sat there, staring at the photograph of her father, smiling next to a man whose son she'd broken a nose for less than a day earlier. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were flat on the bar top, pressed down hard, like she needed something solid to keep from shaking apart. "Say it again," she said. "Quiet! The part about the accident." "Marlowe, say it again." Reeve exhaled slow. "There was no training accident. Your father didn't die overseas in some sanctioned operation. That's the story we gave you, because it was the story that kept you alive. He died 4 miles outside Cedar Hollow, in a warehouse that belonged, at the time, to a shipping company owned by the man in that photograph." Marlowe's throat worked. No sound came out for a moment. 15 years, she finally said. 15 years, and nobody thought to tell his own daughter the truth. "I thought about it every year," Reeve said. "Every single year, Marlowe. And every year I decided the same thing. That a 14-year-old girl grieving her father was safer not knowing the men responsible were still walking around free, still powerful, still watching to see if the truth ever surfaced. And now? Now you put a viral video on the internet with a takedown technique I personally taught exactly one recruit in my entire career," Reeve said. "Now Warwick Halloway has almost certainly already recognized what I recognized, which means the girl I decided to protect by silence just became impossible to protect by silence, which means I had exactly one choice left. Come here, tell you everything. Before somebody else came here first and told you nothing at all. Right before they made sure you couldn't ask any more questions." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Marlowe felt the ripple of them move all the way through her chest. Because that's the thing about the past. You bury it. You think you've buried it deep enough. Except it doesn't stay buried, it just waits. Waits for one video, one viral clip, one drunk rich man's slap across some stranger's cheek. And then it claws its way back up through the dirt with your father's face still smiling in its teeth. "Tell me what he was working on," Marlowe said. "Before he died. All of it." Reeve reached into his coat again. This time he pulled out a thin folder, edges soft with age, and set it on the bar. "Your father spent the last 18 months of his life building a case," he said, "against a smuggling operation running weapons and restricted components out through a private shipping company. Hidden inside legitimate cargo. Hidden well enough that it took him a year and a half just to prove it existed. Halloway's company. Halloway's company, yes." Marlowe's hand drifted toward the folder, stopped an inch above it, like touching it might make all of this permanently, irreversibly real. "He was close," Reeve said. "Closer than anyone realized. He'd identified the shipping routes, the false manifests. He was 3 weeks from handing the whole case over to federal investigators when he died. When he died, Reeve confirmed. And the case died with him. No paper trail survived except what he kept off the official record, which was smart of him, which is also why nobody could ever prove what actually happened. The official file closed within 6 weeks, ruled an accident, and the men who could have pushed back against that ruling were either transferred, retired early, or, in one case, what? Reeve's jaw tightened. In one case, quietly disappeared themselves before he could testify to anything different. Marlowe felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though nothing had physically moved. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that somebody else who knew the truth is also dead?" "I'm telling you," Reeve said, "that your father wasn't working alone. He had one man beside him through most of it. A spotter. A friend. Sergeant Otis Winterbourne. Official record says Winterbourne died in the same incident as your father." "Says." Reeve met her eyes. "I never saw a body, Marlowe. In 15 years, I have never once seen confirmation of that man's remains. The rain kept falling outside. Steady, patient. The way rain falls when it has nowhere better to be, and all the time in the world to wear something down to nothing. Marlowe sat with that thought a long moment. A man who might not be dead. A father who was murdered, not lost. A truth that had waited 15 years in the dark for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, or simply desperate enough to go looking for it. I want to see everything he had, she said. Every page in that folder. Every name. Every route. I want to see all of it. Marlowe. You came here to tell me, she said. So, tell me all the way. Don't you dare protect me halfway again? Reeves studied her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile. Something closer to recognition. Like he was seeing, underneath the bartender's apron and 3 years of careful hiding, the outline of the girl he used to know standing at attention, chin up, refusing to blink first. All right, Ren, he said. All the way, then. He opened the folder. They worked through the night. By the time gray morning light began creeping through the windows of the rusty anchor, the bar top was covered in papers Marlowe had never been meant to see. Shipping manifests with numbers that didn't add up. Photographs of warehouses she didn't recognize, taken from angles that suggested surveillance rather than tourism. A hand-drawn map in her father's own handwriting, routes marked in red ink that had faded to rust brown over 15 patient years, and her father's handwriting everywhere. Small, precise. The same neat block letters he used to leave on the whiteboard in their kitchen when she was a girl, reminding her to feed the dog, to finish her homework, to watch the wind in the leaves before it changed on her. She traced one line of it with her fingertip, felt her chest ache in a place she'd sealed off years ago. He knew, she said quietly. He knew this was dangerous. Look how careful he was. Coded references. No real names anywhere except in the margins, where nobody but him would think to look. He was careful, Reeve agreed. Careful enough that it took him 18 months just to build what's sitting on this bar. Careful enough that whoever silenced him clearly believed he hadn't gotten far enough to be dangerous. Except he had, Reeve said. Which means somewhere along the way, somebody underestimated Desmond Ashcroft, and somebody is about to underestimate his daughter in exactly the same way. Marlowe looked up at him. You think Holloway's already moving? I think a man who built an empire on staying invisible does not enjoy discovering that a viral video of his own son getting dropped by a mystery woman has put a spotlight directly on something he spent 15 years keeping in the dark. I think men like Warwick Holloway do not wait to find out if a threat is real before they act on it. As if summoned by the words themselves, Marlowe's phone buzzed on the counter. An unknown number. No name attached. She stared at it a long moment before answering. Hello. Silence on the other end. Then faint breathing, deliberate. The kind meant to be heard. Then the line went dead. Marlowe set the phone down slowly. Her hand had gone cold. That answer your question, she said. Reeves' expression darkened. We need to move fast. And carefully. Because right now, the only thing keeping you alive is the fact that Holloway doesn't yet know how much you know. The second he suspects you've seen this folder. I understand. I don't think you do, Reeves said. Not unkind. Just certain. 15 years ago, this man was willing to bury a decorated officer to protect a shipping route. You are a bartender in a town of 2,000 people with no official protection and no backup. You are not equipped for what's fought coming. Marlowe's eyes flashed. Something old and sharp surfacing beneath the exhaustion. I dropped a 200-pound man in under 2 seconds without even trying. Commander, I think I can handle a phone call with no voice on the other end. That's not the same thing as. I know exactly what it's not the same thing as. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. Because underneath the sharpness, underneath the training, clawing back up through 3 years of buried instinct, there was still a 14-year-old girl, standing at a closed casket, being told a lie so smooth it took 15 years and a bar fight to finally crack it open. Reeves softened. I'm not trying to insult you, Marlowe. I'm trying to keep you breathing. There's a difference between courage and readiness. And right now you have a great deal of the first and none of the second. She wiped her eyes, fast, almost angry at herself for the wetness there at all. Then help me get ready, she said. Sheriff Nash Corbett showed up at the Rusty Anchor a little after 9 that morning, looking like a man who hadn't slept much better than Marlowe had. He took one look at the papers spread across the bar, at the tired stranger in the expensive coat sitting across from his town's favorite bartender, and his hand drifted instinctively toward his belt. "Marlowe," he said carefully, "everything all right in here?" "It's fine, Sheriff." "Doesn't look fine." His eyes moved over the documents, landed on a photograph of a warehouse, then flicked up toward Reeve with open suspicion. "Who's this?" "An old friend," Marlowe said. "Funny. Never seen this old friend around Cedar Hollow before." Corbett's tone had gone flat, careful. The tone of a man who'd spent 18 years learning to read a room before the room finished explaining itself. "Sheriff Corbett," Reeve said, standing, extending a hand. "Commander Atticus Reeve. Retired." Corbett didn't take the hand right away. "Retired from what?" "Exactly. That's classified," Reeve said. "Not unkindly, just factually. Everything about your face says you're used to people not asking twice when you say that." "You'd be correct." The two men stared at each other a long moment, the kind of silent measuring two careful men do when they're each deciding how much the other one can be trusted. "He's telling the truth about my father," Marlowe said finally, breaking the standoff. "About what really happened to him." "Nash, I need you to sit down. I need you to look at this." Something in her voice made the sheriff's shoulders drop half an inch. He pulled out a stool and sat. They spent the next hour walking him through everything: the photographs, the manifests, the map in her father's handwriting. Corbett's face went through several stages as he listened, from skepticism to disbelief to something grimmer and more settled by the time they finished. "I've lived in this county my whole life," he said quietly. "I've known the Halloways since I was a boy. Warwick's father used to hand out candy on the 4th of July. He shook his head slowly. "You're telling me this family's been running weapons through this county for 15 years, and nobody so much as blinked?" "I'm telling you," Reeve said, "that men like Warwick Halloway don't get caught by blinking. They get caught by one small mistake, made by one overconfident son, in one bar, in front of one woman his father should have recognized 15 years sooner." Corbett rubbed a hand down his face. "This is federal territory, way above what my department's built to handle." "I agree," Reeve said, "which is why I've already reached out to a contact inside a federal task force with an active interest in Halloway Maritime shipping practices. But federal interest moves slow, Sheriff, and I have reason to believe Warwick Halloway does not intend to move slow at all." As if the universe wanted to underline the point, the front door of the Rusty Anchor swung open at that exact moment, and a woman walked in Marlowe hadn't seen in almost 10 years. Marlowe's whole body went rigid, because that face older now, sharper around the eyes, but unmistakably, achingly familiar, belonged to someone she hadn't spoken to since she was 19 years old, and furious and certain she'd never forgive her for leaving the way she did. Delphine, Marlowe breathed. Her older sister stood in the doorway, rain-damp hair clinging to her cheeks, a battered cardboard box clutched against her chest like a shield. "I saw the video," Delphine said. Her voice shook slightly. "I saw it 3 times before I even realized it was you. And then I couldn't stop thinking about." She stopped, swallowed. "I found something, Marlowe. Something of Dad's. I've had it for years and I never opened it because I couldn't. I couldn't. But after I saw what you did in that bar, I thought..." "Delphine, what's in the box?" Her sister crossed the room slowly, set the box down on the bar between the scattered documents like it belonged there all along. Like some part of her had known, without knowing, that this exact moment was waiting for her. "His journal," Delphine said. "The last one. They gave it to me when they cleared out his things. Because I was older, because I was supposed to be the responsible one. I put it in a closet and I never opened it once in 15 years, because opening it meant he was really gone, and I wasn't ready. I don't think I've ever been ready." Marlowe stared at the box like it might catch fire. Reeve leaned forward slightly, voice careful. "May I ask what made you decide to open it now?" Delphine's eyes filled, fast, unexpected. Because I watched my little sister put a man on the floor like she was born to it, and I realized I don't actually know who she is anymore. I don't know who either of us became after we stopped being a family and started just being two women who happened to share a father. And I thought maybe it's time I stopped being afraid of what's inside that box. Maybe it's time we both stopped. Marlowe's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside sat a leather-bound journal, edges worn soft, her father's initials pressed faintly into the cover. She hadn't seen his handwriting outside of that folder in 15 years, and here it was again, filling page after page after page. She opened to the last entry. Her breath caught. The date was 3 days before he died. They're closer than they realize, the entry read. If something happens to me, the proof is where little Wren and I used to watch the birds. She'll know. She always knew where to look. Marlowe's vision blurred. The birds, she whispered. The oak tree. Behind the old house. He used to take me there before dawn to watch the wren's nest in the... Her voice broke off entirely. Reeve went very still. Marlowe, if there's physical evidence hidden somewhere your father trusted only you to find, then it's still there, Marlowe said, wiping her face fast, fierce, refusing to let the tears win the moment. 15 years, and nobody ever thought to look, because nobody else ever knew where to look. Corbett stood abruptly. I'll drive you out there myself. No. Marlowe's voice was sharp now, steady, the training rising back up through her like a current finding its old riverbed. If Holloway's watching me, and I think we all agree he probably is, then a caravan of official vehicles heading out to my childhood home is the fastest way to make sure whatever's out there gets found by the wrong people first. Then how? Quietly, Marlowe said. Tonight. Just me. Absolutely not, Reeve said. Not alone. He's right, Delphine said, surprising everyone, her chin lifting with a stubbornness Marlowe he painfully remembered from childhood arguments over nothing at all. You're not doing this without me. He was my father, too. Marlowe looked at her sister, really looked at her, for the first time in a decade. Saw past the years of silence and hurt feelings and holidays spent apart to the girl she used to whisper secrets to under a shared blanket during thunderstorms just like this one. Okay, Marlowe said softly. Together then. They went that night, after the storm passed and the roads had drained enough to travel. Marlowe drove, Delphine silent beside her, in the passenger seat. The old house rising up out of the dark at the end of a gravel road neither of them had traveled in over a decade. The house sat empty now, sold years ago to a family who'd since moved on themselves. The porch sagging slightly, the paint peeling in long pale strips. Nobody lived there currently. Nobody would notice two women walking the tree line behind it in the dark. The oak tree stood exactly where Marlowe remembered it, massive, ancient. Its branches spread wide enough to have sheltered 3 generations of nesting wrens, including once a little girl and her father, sitting quiet in the pre-dawn cold, watching small brown birds build something delicate out of nothing at all. There, Marlowe whispered, pointing to a hollow low in the trunk. Worn smooth by decades of small birds and small hands. That's where we used to leave breadcrumbs. That's where he'd let me put my hand in and feel the nest, if the mother wasn't home. She reached inside. Her fingers brushed against something that wasn't bark, wasn't bird's nest, something hard and rectangular, wrapped in what felt like decades-old plastic, tucked deep enough into the hollow that 15 years of wind and rain had never once disturbed it. She pulled it free. A small metal case, the kind used for storing important documents against weather and time. Her hands shook as she worked the corroded latch. Inside, protected all these years, sat a second folder, thicker than the one Reeve had brought. Photographs, financial records, a single flash drive, still miraculously intact. And on top, a single folded note in her father's handwriting. If you're reading this, he'd written, then you found it. Which means I was right about you, which I always was. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth while I was alive. I'm sorry for every lie by omission, every mission I couldn't explain, every birthday I missed protecting people who will never know your name. But I need you to finish what I started, little Wren. Not because it's fair to ask a child to carry her father's unfinished war. Because you're the only one I trust to carry it right. Marlo sank to her knees in the wet grass beneath the oak tree, her father's letter trembling in her hands. 15 years of grief and confusion and buried anger finally breaking open all at once. Delphine knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. And for a long moment neither sister said anything at all, just held each other beneath the tree that had once sheltered a family that used to be whole. He knew, Marlo finally managed. He knew someone might come for him, and he still went after them anyway. Because that's who he was, Delphine said softly. Somebody who couldn't look away from something wrong, even when looking away would have kept him alive to watch us grow up. I hated him for a while, Marlo admitted, the words scraping raw out of her throat, after he died. I hated that he chose something else over us. Some mission, some cause I didn't even understand. I know, Delphine said. I hated you a little too, for a long time. For being the one he trained. For being the one who got to be like him, while I just got to be the one who left. You didn't leave because of him. I left because staying hurt too much, Delphine said. Watching you become him. Watching everyone treat you like the second coming of Colonel Ashcroft, while I just felt like the daughter who didn't matter as much. Her voice cracked. I'm not proud of that. I've had 10 years to be ashamed of it. Marlo reached out, took her sister's hand in the dark beneath the tree. I never wanted to be the favorite. I just wanted him to come home. I know, Delphine whispered. I know that now. They stayed there a long while, two sisters in the wet grass. Finally, after 15 years, grieving the same man in the same place at the same time, instead of each doing it alone in separate silences 1,000 miles apart. By the time they made it back to Cedar Hollow, the eastern sky had begun turning pale gray at the edges. Reeve was waiting on the porch of the rusty Anchor, pacing, visibly relieved, when Marlo's headlights finally swung into view. You found something, he said, reading it instantly in her face. Everything, Marlo said, holding up the metal case. Financial records, photographs, a flash drive he must have hidden right before he died. Reeve's expression turned grim and focused all at once. We need to see what's on that drive. Immediately. And we need somewhere secure to look at it. Somewhere Holloway's people wouldn't think to watch. My office, Corbett said, appearing in the doorway behind him, having apparently kept vigil at the bar all night waiting for their return. Nobody watches the sheriff's office in this town. Nobody's ever had a reason to. They gathered there an hour later, Marlo, Delphine, Reeve, and Corbett, crowded around an aging desktop computer in the small back office of the Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Department. The flash drive finally connected, its contents slowly loading onto the screen. What they found made the room go silent. Financial transfers, dozens of them, spanning years, moving money between shell companies, with names designed to mean nothing to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. Photographs of warehouse interiors, crates marked with false agricultural labels, their true contents visible in close-up shots her father had clearly taken at enormous personal risk. And buried 3 folders deep, a document that made Marlo's blood run cold. An internal memo, dated barely a week before her father's death, listing names of individuals with access to sensitive shipping schedules. One name near the bottom, highlighted in her father's own hand, a small red circle drawn around it in ink that had gone brown with age. Commissioner Aldous Renner. That's, Corbett's voice caught. That's the county commissioner. He's been on the county board for over 20 years. He approved half the permits Holloway's company operates under, which means, Reeve said slowly, that if your father identified him as a person of interest 15 years ago, and this same man is still sitting on the county board today, holding regulatory power over Holloway's shipping operations, he's still compromised, Marlo finished. He's been Holloway's man inside this county government for 15 years, and nobody ever caught it, because everybody trusted him. Because that's exactly what men like that count on. Corbett sat back heavily in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Renner sits 3 offices down from mine. I've had coffee with that man 100 times. I trusted him. That's precisely why he's dangerous, Reeve said. The best inside man isn't the one who looks suspicious. It's the one everybody stops watching, because he's been there so long he's become part of the furniture. Marlowe's mind raced backward, connecting threads she hadn't even realized were tangled together until this exact moment. The unmarked phone call. The dead silence on the other end, meant to be heard. The speed with which Holloway must have already known enough to send that message, less than a day after the video went viral. "He's had eyes on me since the moment that video posted," she said slowly. "Which means somebody in this county has been feeding information straight to Holloway this whole time. Which means—" She stopped cold, because a new terrible thought had just surfaced. "Nash," she said carefully. "Who else knew we were meeting here tonight?" Corbett's face went pale. "Nobody, just us four. Are you certain?" He hesitated. Just half a second, but it was enough. "I logged into the department system to pull the case file on the bar incident," he admitted slowly. "Standard procedure. I didn't think who has access to that system." Corbett's throat worked. The department and the county board offices for permitting cross-references. His eyes widened as the realization landed. Renner's office has system access. The room went very still. Reeves stood abruptly, already moving toward the window, scanning the dark street outside with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades assuming, correctly, that safety was always temporary. "We need to move this evidence somewhere secure," he said. "Tonight, before anyone with system access realizes exactly what's just been uploaded to a department computer." "Too late for that," said a voice from the doorway. Every head in the room turned. Commissioner Aldous Renner stood framed in the entrance to the sheriff's office, rain-damp coat still dripping onto the floor, a look on his face that had already shed every trace of the friendly, familiar mask Cedar Hollow had trusted for over 20 years. Behind him stood two men Marlowe had never seen before, broad-shouldered, expressionless. The particular stillness of men paid well to be unremarkable, right up until the moment they weren't. "Aldous," Corbett said slowly, rising from his chair. "What is this?" "Sit back down, Sheriff." Renner's voice had gone flat, cold. Nothing left of the warm, familiar tone he'd used at 100 county meetings over 2 decades. "I really did like you, you know? All of you. Made this a great deal harder than it needed to be." "You're the leak," Marlowe said, not a question. "You've been Holloway's man this whole time." Renner's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Your father figured that out too, near the end. Clever man. Wasted, honestly, on a county this small." He glanced toward the computer screen, toward the file still glowing open, his own name circled in her father's 15-year-old ink. "Looks like the daughter inherited the same unfortunate habit of looking exactly where she shouldn't." "Get out of my office," Corbett said, hand drifting toward his sidearm. "I wouldn't," Renner said mildly, and one of the men behind him shifted his coat just enough to reveal the weapon holstered underneath. "Let's all be reasonable adults about this. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here for the drive. And whatever else you found tonight, you'll have to take it from me," Marlowe said, stepping forward. Every muscle in her body coiling tight, old instincts rising fast and sure beneath her skin. Renner's eyes flicked over her with something almost like respect. "I saw the video too, you know. Everyone did. Very impressive. Truly." His gaze hardened. "But there were 4 of you and 2 of me in that footage. Tonight there's 2 of us and one very large problem standing between you and the door." Reeves' hand moved slowly, carefully toward his own coat. "I wouldn't," Renner said again, sharper this time. For one long, suspended moment, the small back office of the Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Department held its breath. 4 people who trusted each other, facing down 2 strangers, and a man they'd trusted for 20 years. The flash drive still glowing open on the desk between them, holding 15 years of buried truth that somebody was now willing to bury a second time, permanently, if that's what it took. Marlowe's eyes met Delphine's across the room, saw her sister's fear, saw underneath it something steadier, something that hadn't been there 10 years ago, back when Delphine was still the sister who ran instead of stayed. Marlowe's mind raced. Because there were exits. Because there were always exits, if you'd been trained to see them, and she had been, once, a lifetime ago in a program that officially never existed. Because the man on the left favored his right leg, weight, uneven, an old injury maybe, something she could use. Because Renner himself hadn't drawn a weapon, which meant orders, which meant he wasn't supposed to be the one to pull a trigger tonight, which meant there was a window, a small one, but a window. Nash, she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Renner. Lights. Corbett's hand found the switch behind him without hesitation, trusting her without needing to ask why. The office plunged into sudden darkness, and in that single suspended heartbeat of confusion, Marlowe moved. She didn't know yet, in that frozen half-second before everything happened at once, whether this decision would save all their lives or end them. She only knew what her father's letter had told her. 3 days before his death, 15 years too late for her to have heard it when it mattered most. I need you to finish what I started. Not because it's fair, because you're the only one I trust to carry it right. The dark office erupted into motion, and somewhere above Cedar Hollow, the last of the storm clouds finally broke apart, revealing a thin, cold sliver of moon that watched, indifferent, as a 15-year-old truth finally, violently, refused to stay buried any longer. Part 3. What the wind carries home. Darkness in the sheriff's office lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was all Marlowe needed. She moved low, fast, toward the man with the uneven stance, the one favoring his right leg, the one whose old injury she'd clocked the second he stepped through the door. Her shoulder caught him mid-stride, driving him sideways into a filing cabinet with a crash that swallowed the room whole. Because you don't fight fair. Because fair was never the point. Because somewhere in the chaos, Delphine screamed, and Corbett shouted something that got lost in the noise, and Reeves' voice cut through the dark, low and sharp, telling everyone to stay down, stay down, stay down. The lights snapped back on. Renner stood frozen by the door, hand halfway to his coat, blinking against the sudden brightness. His second man had a gun half raised, aimed at nothing, aimed at everything, sweeping the room in a panic he hadn't trained enough to hide. And Marlowe stood over the first man, his own weapon now in her hand, pointed steady at Renner's chest. Nobody moved. "Drop it," she said, quiet, which was worse than if she'd screamed it. "Both of you now." The second man's eyes flicked toward Renner, waiting for orders that didn't fast enough. "I said now." Something in her voice finally landed. The gun clattered to the floor. Then the second one. Corbett was already moving, cuffs out, years of training taking over the second the danger broke. And within 30 seconds the two men were on their knees, hands zip-tied, faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Renner alone remained standing, watching Marlowe with something that had curdled from contempt into something closer to fear. "You're just like him," he said quietly. "Your father. Same terrible timing. Same refusal to just let things stay buried. Some things shouldn't stay buried." Marlowe's hand didn't waver. "Sit down, Commissioner." He sat. Corbett radioed for backup, voice tight and fast. And within 20 minutes the small sheriff's office was crawling with deputies. Renner and his 2 men loaded into separate cruisers. The flash drive and metal case sealed carefully into evidence, bags by hands that shook only slightly. Marlowe stood on the front steps afterward, breathing hard, adrenaline finally starting to bleed out of her system in slow, cold waves. Delphine appeared beside her, wrapping an arm tight around her shoulders, both of them staring out at the wet street where red and blue lights painted the puddles in slow, silent rhythm. "You could have died in there," Delphine whispered. "I didn't. You could have. I know." Marlowe's voice cracked, just slightly, the fear finally catching up to her now that there was room for it. "I know, Delphine. But Dad didn't die so somebody else could bury the truth a second time. Not while I was standing there able to stop it." Delphine pulled her into a full embrace then, fierce and sudden, 15 years of distance collapsing into the space of one long, shuddering breath. "I'm not losing you too," Delphine said into her shoulder. "You hear me? Whatever happens next, I'm not losing you too. You won't. You don't know that." "No," Marlowe admitted. "I don't. But I'm done running from what I am, Delphine. I spent 3 years pretending to be somebody smaller than myself. And all it got me was a father's murder staying buried 15 years too long. I'm done with small. Reeves stepped out onto the porch behind them, phone still pressed to his ear, finishing a call in low, clipped tones. He hung up, expression grim. That was my federal contact, he said. Agent Priya Okonkwo, task force lead on Holloway Maritime. She's seen the financial records. Seen the memo with Renner's name circled. She says it's enough to open a formal investigation. But what? But it's not enough to touch Warwick Holloway himself. Not yet. Everything on that drive points to a 15-year-old smuggling operation and one compromised commissioner. It doesn't put a weapon in Holloway's hand. It doesn't prove he ordered your father's death. Marlowe's jaw tightened. Then we get more. Marlowe, he's not getting away with this, Commander. 15 years of my life. 15 years of Delphine's life. 15 years of my father lying in the ground under a lie somebody built specifically to keep his own daughter from ever asking the right questions. I am not stopping at a compromised commissioner. Reeves studied her a long moment. Something in his face shifted, some old soldier's instinct, recognizing another soldier standing right in front of him, fully awake now, fully armed with purpose, if nothing else. Then we need Otis Winterbourne, he said finally. If he's alive. If he's been hiding all these years the way I suspected he has. He was there the night your father died, Marlowe. He may be the only living witness who actually knows what happened in that warehouse. Then we find him. Easier said, Reeve murmured. A man capable of disappearing for 15 years without a single federal database. Catching a trace of him did not disappear by accident. If he's alive because he's very, very good at staying invisible. Marlowe looked out at the rain-slicked street, at the lights still spinning red and blue against the dark, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. Cold, certain. The particular calm that came right before a mission, the kind she hadn't felt in 3 long years and hadn't realized, until this exact moment, how much she'd missed. Then let's find someone who's good at staying invisible, she said, with someone who used to be even better at it. Warwick Holloway received the news of Renner's arrest at 4 in the morning, standing barefoot in his kitchen, staring at his phone with an expression that had gone completely, dangerously still. Deacon appeared in the doorway behind him, still nursing his bruised nose, blinking sleep from his eyes. Dad? What's going on? Renner's been arrested, Warwick said, flat, quiet. So? He'll lawyer up. He knows how this works. He won't talk. He doesn't have to talk. Warwick set the phone down on the counter, with exaggerated care, the kind of careful movement men use when what they actually want to do is throw something across the room. They have financial records, photographs, a memo with his name circled in Desmond Ashcroft's own handwriting. Deacon's face went pale. That was 15 years ago. I thought so too. Warwick's voice had gone dangerously soft, which means someone kept evidence hidden for 15 years, and someone finally found it. Which means, Deacon, that your idiotic decision to raise a hand against a stranger in a bar has unraveled 15 years of very, very careful work in under 1 week. This isn't my fault. Everything about this is your fault. Warwick turned, and for the first time, Deacon saw something in his father's eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. Not anger. Something colder. Something that had learned, decades ago, that survival sometimes required decisions a son wasn't equipped to understand. Go to your mother's house in the city. Now. Do not answer calls from anyone you don't recognize. Do not go anywhere near Cedar Hollow again until I tell you it's safe. What are you going to do? Warwick didn't answer. He simply picked his phone back up and began scrolling toward a contact he hadn't used in over a decade. A name saved under a false label, a number that would connect to a man whose specific skills existed entirely outside the boundaries of anything legal. Because when careful men run out of careful options, they reach for the only tool left in the drawer. And Warwick Holloway had just run out of careful. They found Otis Winterbourne 2 days later, in a mountain town 4 hours north of Cedar Hollow, living under a name that wasn't his own, working as a groundskeeper, for a small church cemetery that had never once questioned why a quiet, weathered man with old scars along his forearms preferred night shifts and empty rooms. Reeve had tracked him through a network of contacts so old and so quiet that Marlowe suspected some of them didn't officially exist either. Men who'd served alongside her father in the years before she was even born. Men who owed Reeve favors going back decades and had finally, carefully, called them in. They pulled into the cemetery's gravel lot just before dusk. The sky bruised purple and gold above rows of weathered headstones. A man stood near the far fence line, raking leaves with slow, deliberate movements, his back to the road. Marlowe's chest tightened the moment she saw him, because there was something in the shape of his shoulders, something in the specific way he held his head, angled slightly, always listening, always watching without seeming to. Something achingly, impossibly familiar, though she'd never met this man in her life. "Otis," Reeve called out, voice carrying soft across the quiet rows of headstones. The man went still. The rake stopped moving. For a long moment, he didn't turn around at all. "Been a long time since anyone called me that," he said finally, voice rough with disuse, like something unearthed after years underground. "You've got about 4 seconds to explain yourself before I disappear again, Commander. And this time you won't find me." "I'm not here alone," Reeve said. "I've brought Desmond Ashcroft's daughter." Otis Winterbourne turned around slowly. His face was older than Marlowe had imagined, weathered deep by 15 years of hiding, a long scar tracing pale down one side of his jaw. But his eyes, when they finally landed on her face, went wide with something raw and immediate. "Little Wren," he breathed. Marlowe's breath caught. "You knew me? I held you the day you were born," Otis said, voice thick. "Your father made me swear I'd look after you if anything ever happened to him, and then I broke that promise for 15 years, because I was too much of a coward to come back and face what happened to him." "You weren't a coward," Marlowe said. "You were hiding because staying visible would have gotten you killed the same way it got him killed." Otis's jaw worked. He looked down at the rake in his hands like he'd forgotten it was there, then set it carefully against the fence. "You want to know what happened that night," he said. "Not a question." "I need to know," Marlowe said. "All of it." Otis looked past her, toward the horizon where the last light was bleeding out of the sky, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, the silence stretching thin and taut between them like a wire pulled to its breaking point. "Come inside," he said finally. "This isn't a story you tell standing in a graveyard at dusk, though God knows it's fitting enough." They sat in Otis' small cottage behind the church, a single lamp burning low, rain beginning to tap soft against the windows once more. He made coffee nobody drank, his hands trembling slightly as he finally, after 15 years of silence, began to speak. "Your father and Warwick Halloway," he said, "used to be friends, real friends. Before any of this, before the shipping company, before the money changed everything about who Warwick became." Marlowe blinked. "Friends? Served together, years before you were born. Different unit, same operation, back when things were simpler, and the lines between right and wrong hadn't gotten so expensive to draw." Otis's eyes went distant, remembering. "Warwick Halloway was a good man once. Believe that or don't, but I watched it with my own eyes. He pulled your father out of a situation that should have killed him. Saved his life, plain as that." "What happened to him?" "Money happened," Otis said simply. "He inherited that shipping company from his father, and for a while it was legitimate. Then the numbers stopped adding up the way he wanted them to, and somebody offered him a very quiet, very profitable solution to that problem. Weapons routed through legal cargo, small at first, then bigger, then too big to walk back from, and my father found out." "Your father found out," Otis confirmed, "because Warwick made the mistake of trusting an old friend with just enough information to ease his own guilty conscience. Wanted somebody to tell him it wasn't as bad as he knew it was. Your father wasn't able to do that. Not for anybody. Not even an old friend who'd once saved his life." Marlowe's hands curled into fists in her lap, so he decided to expose him instead. "He decided to give him a chance first," Otis said. "That's the part nobody knows. Your father went to Warwick directly, before he ever built that case file. Told him to shut it down. Told him there was still time to walk away clean, that he wouldn't have to say a word to anyone if Warwick just stopped. He refused. He refused, Otis said, voice cracking now, 15 years of guilt finally spilling loose. Said it had gone too far. Said there were people above him now who wouldn't let him walk away even if he wanted to. Begged your father, actually begged him to look the other way. Just this once. For old time's sake. And my father said no. Your father, Otis said, told him that old time's sake was exactly why he couldn't look away. Because the man he used to know would never have asked him to. The rain fell harder outside, drumming against the cottage roof, and for a long moment nobody in the small room said anything at all. The night he died, Marlowe finally managed. Were you there? Otis nodded slowly, his eyes wet now, unashamed. I was his spotter that night. We'd gone to the warehouse to collect one final piece of evidence. Should have been simple. Should have been in and out in 20 minutes. His voice broke. Warwick wasn't even supposed to be there himself. But he came, begged your father one more time to stop, right there in that warehouse, at 2 in the morning, surrounded by crates full of the very evidence that was about to end everything he'd built. And your father told him no again. Told him this was the last time he'd ask. Told him the federal case was already moving, that it was too late to stop. That the only choice left was whether Warwick turned himself in or waited to be caught. Otis wiped a hand roughly across his face. That's when the other men arrived. Warwick's security. I don't believe, to this day, that Warwick gave the order himself. I believe somebody above him had grown tired of waiting for a decision he wasn't brave enough to make on his own. What happened? There was a struggle, Otis said quietly. Your father went down protecting the evidence. I went down trying to protect him. I woke up 2 days later in a motel room 4 states away, patched up by a stranger I paid in cash, with no memory of how I got there, and every reason in the world to believe that if anyone found out I was still breathing, I wouldn't stay that way for long. So you disappeared. I disappeared, Otis confirmed, and I have spent 15 years hating myself for it every single day. For not coming back. For not fighting for the truth the way your father did, right up until the moment it cost him everything. His eyes met hers, raw and pleading. I'm sorry, Wren. I'm so sorry. I should have found you years ago. I should have told you the truth instead of leaving you to grieve a lie. Marlowe sat with the weight of it a long moment. 15 years of carefully preserved grief, cracking open all at once into something far messier and far more complicated than the simple, clean sorrow she'd carried since she was 14. Because her father hadn't just been murdered. He'd been murdered by an old friend's cowardice, dressed up as inevitability. And that old friend was still out there, still wealthy, still powerful, still telling himself some careful story about how none of it had really been his fault. Will you testify? Marlowe asked quietly. To all of it, on the record, in front of federal investigators. Otis's hands trembled around his untouched coffee mug. It would mean coming out of hiding. It would mean Warwick's people finally knowing I'm alive. I know what it would mean. It could get me killed. I know that too. Marlowe held his gaze steady. But my father died trying to stop this. And you've spent 15 years hiding from a truth he gave his life defending. I'm not going to tell you what to do, Otis. But I am going to ask you, one time, the way I imagine he would have asked you himself. Are you still the man who was brave enough to be his spotter? Or did that man really die in that warehouse 15 years ago too? Otis Winterbourne closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something in his face had changed. The years of hiding finally, visibly, beginning to lift off his shoulders like a weight he'd been waiting 15 years for permission to set down. I'll testify, he said. God help me. I'll testify. They moved fast after that. Agent Priya Okonkwo arrived in Cedar Hollow within 36 hours, a sharp-eyed federal investigator who listened to Otis Winterbourne's full statement with a careful, unblinking patience that Marlowe found herself grateful for, in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Corbett coordinated local security. Reeve worked his old contacts to arrange federal protection for Otis finally, after 15 years no longer hiding entirely alone. And Marlowe waited. waited through 3 long days of depositions and evidence review, watching from the sidelines as the machinery of justice, slow and careful and infinitely more patient than she felt, began finally closing around Warwick Halloway, until the 4th day, when everything accelerated at once. Because Warwick Halloway, watching his empire crumble one careful brick at a time, made the same mistake every desperate man before him had made. He decided that if the truth was coming for him regardless, he would at least choose the terms of the ending himself. He requested a meeting. Not with investigators, not with lawyers, with Marlowe. She stood on the dock behind Halloway Maritime's main warehouse. At dusk 2 days later, the same warehouse, Reeve had confirmed quietly, where her father had died 15 years earlier. Wind moved cold and sharp off the water, carrying the smell of salt and diesel and something underneath it that felt, absurdly, like memory itself. Warwick Halloway stood waiting near the water's edge, alone, no security in sight, his silver hair catching the last orange light of the setting sun. "You came alone," he said, as she approached. "Bold, or reckless. I've never been entirely sure which quality your father had more of." "Both, probably," Marlowe said. "Family trait, from what I understand." Warwick's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You look like him, you know. Around the eyes. I noticed it in that video before I even knew who you were. Something about the way you moved. It stopped my heart for a full second before my brain caught up." "Is that why you tried to have me killed? Sentiment?" His jaw tightened. "I never gave that order. Renner works for you. Renner works for people above me," Warwick said. And for the first time, something genuine cracked through the careful composure he'd worn his whole adult life. "You think I built this alone, Marlowe? You think a man just wakes up one morning and decides to become a smuggler? I inherited debts, obligations. Men who don't accept the word no from anyone, including the person whose name is on the building. That's not an excuse." "I know it's not," Warwick said quietly. "I've known that for 15 years. Every single day since I stood in that warehouse and watched your father die for refusing to look away from something I was too weak to stop myself." The wind picked up off the water, cold and sharp, carrying the distant cry of a gull somewhere out over the dark waves. "He told me something that night," Warwick continued, voice rough now. "Right before it happened. He said, 'Warwick, the man I used to know would never have let this happen to either of us.' And he was right. He was right. And I still didn't stop it, because by then I'd convinced myself I couldn't. That the machine was too big, too far along. That walking away meant my own death instead of just his. You let them kill him. I have relived that decision every single day for 15 years, Warwick said, and his voice broke fully now, the careful mask finally, completely gone. I have stood at galas and shaken hands and smiled for cameras while carrying that warehouse floor inside my chest like a stone I can never set down. I am not asking for your forgiveness, Marlowe. I know I don't deserve it. I am asking you to understand that I am not the same simple villain your investigators want to paint me as." "Simple villain or not," Marlowe said, voice steady, despite the storm rising inside her chest. "You let a good man die. You let his daughter grow up believing a lie. You let his family break apart under grief you could have prevented with one honest choice. 15 years ago, in this exact spot." Warwick's shoulders sagged, the weight of it finally, visibly crushing something in him that had held rigid for a decade and a half. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to turn yourself in," Marlowe said. "Fully, completely. Every name, every route, every dollar. I want you to give the federal investigators everything they need to dismantle this operation permanently. And I want you to do it because it's right, not because you got caught. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested within the hour regardless," Marlowe said. "Agent Okonkwo has federal agents positioned within half a mile of this dock right now. I came alone because I needed to hear this from you myself, not because you had any real choice left in how this ends." Warwick stared at her a long moment, the last light draining from the sky behind him, and something in his face finally, completely surrendered. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. "I know that's not worth much, coming from me, but I mean it. He'd be proud of exactly the woman standing in front of me right now. I don't need your approval of him, Marlowe said. I already know who he was. Warwick nodded slowly, reached into his coat, and for one frozen half-second Marlowe's entire body coiled tight, old instinct screaming a warning through every nerve she had. He withdrew nothing but a folded piece of paper. Held it out toward her, hand trembling slightly. My full confession, he said, written 3 days ago when I first realized how this would end. Every route, every account, every name above me who thought they were untouchable, I was going to burn it. I'm glad now that I didn't. Marlowe took it carefully, her own hands steadier than she expected. Behind them, headlights swept across the dock as federal vehicles finally rolled into view. Agent Okonkwo's team moving with quiet, practiced efficiency toward the warehouse. Warwick didn't run, didn't resist. He simply stood at the water's edge, watching the last light fade off the waves, waiting for the ending he'd spent 15 years both fearing and, in some small, exhausted way, hoping for. For what it's worth, he said, as agents approached to take him into custody, I am glad it was you who finally stopped this. I think some part of me has been waiting 15 years for Desmond's daughter to come finish what he started. Strange kind of mercy, having it end this way. Marlowe watched them lead him away in silence, the confession still trembling faintly in her hand. The wind off the water finally, gradually, beginning to settle. 3 weeks later, Cedar Hollow held a ceremony nobody in town would ever forget. Federal investigators had spent that time dismantling what remained of Holloway Maritime's smuggling network, following Warwick's confession through a web of accounts and shell companies that stretched further than even Marlowe had imagined. Deacon, questioned extensively, cooperated fully once he understood the scope of what his father had built, his own legal troubles from the bar incident becoming almost an afterthought against the larger case. Commissioner Renner, along with 3 other officials, faced formal federal charges within the month. And on a bright, clear Saturday morning, the town of Cedar Hollow gathered at the small military cemetery on the hill above the county line, where a headstone bearing the name Colonel Desmond Ashcroft had stood, quietly wrong, for 15 long years. A new plaque was unveiled that morning, placed beside the original stone by federal officials, who'd finally, formally, corrected the record. No longer training accident overseas classified. Instead, simple words that finally told the truth. Died in service, uncovering corruption that endangered American lives. Survived by his daughters Marlowe and Delphine, whose courage finished what he started. Marlowe stood at the front of the small gathered crowd, Delphine's hand tight in hers, watching sunlight move slow and gold across rows of white headstones, exactly the way it used to move across the wooden floor of the rusty anchor on quiet mornings, back before any of this began. Beside her stood a tall, weathered man in his late 70s, silver-haired, standing with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to stand at attention even when nobody was watching anymore. Her grandfather, Silas Ashcroft, hadn't spoken much since arriving in town 3 days earlier. He'd simply held Marlowe close the moment he saw her, longer and tighter than she remembered him ever holding anyone, and murmured against her hair words she'd carry with her the rest of her life. You look just like him, little Wren. God help you, you look just like him. Now he stood beside her at the grave, medals from his own service catching the morning light, a veteran of Operation Desert Storm, who had buried his own share of good men over the decades, and understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what this moment cost and exactly what it meant. He'd be embarrassed by all this fuss, Silas said quietly, nodding toward the small crowd. The local news cameras kept respectfully at a distance, the flowers already piling at the base of the corrected stone. Your father never did like being the center of attention. He should have thought of that before he became the kind of man worth making a fuss over, Marlowe said, and something in her grandfather's weathered face cracked into the first real smile she'd seen from him since he arrived. That's exactly what he would have said to me, Silas murmured, word for word near enough. He reached out, took her hand in his own weathered one, the same hand that had once, decades ago, taught a young soldier named Desmond Ashcroft how to hold a rifle steady in the desert heat. You did something today most people never manage in a lifetime, Marlowe. You gave your father back his name. You gave this whole family back its truth. I couldn't have done it alone, Marlowe said, glancing toward Delphine, toward Reeve, standing respectfully near the back of the crowd, toward Otis Winterbourne, finally publicly free after 15 years of hiding, standing quiet and dignified near the tree line. None of us could have. That's the lesson your father always tried to teach, Silas said. Strength isn't standing alone. It's knowing exactly who's standing beside you when it matters most. The ceremony continued through the morning, simple and dignified, local officials speaking briefly, Agent Okonkwo offering a formal federal statement confirming the case's resolution, Sheriff Corbett standing tall and proud near the front, having earned, through 3 exhausting weeks, a respect from his town that would follow him the rest of his career. But it was the quiet moment afterward, once the crowd had finally dispersed and only family remained, that Marlowe would remember most clearly for the rest of her life. She knelt at her father's grave alone, Delphine, standing a respectful distance back, giving her the space she needed. She placed her palm flat against the cool stone, tracing the newly carved letters of his corrected record with careful fingers. I found the bird's nest, she whispered. The one behind the old house. It wasn't there anymore, of course. 15 years is a long time for a nest to survive. But I stood under that oak tree anyway, and I swear I could still hear them. Still feel you standing there beside me, telling me to watch the wind before it changes. The morning breeze moved soft through the cemetery, rustling leaves somewhere just beyond the tree line, and for one strange, suspended moment, Marlowe could have sworn she heard, faint and distant, the particular call of a wren singing somewhere close by. I finished it, Dad, she said quietly, tears finally, fully falling now, unashamed, 15 years overdue. I finished what you started. I hope somewhere, somehow you know that. Delphine knelt beside her a moment later, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, both sisters kneeling together at their father's grave in the warm morning sun. 15 years of separate, silent grief, finally, completely shared. He knows, Delphine said softly. I have to believe he knows. They stayed there a long while, until the sun climbed high and warm above the hills, until the last of the morning mist finally burned away entirely, revealing Cedar Hollow spread out below them, quiet and unremarkable and utterly, completely changed. The rusty anchor reopened the following week, busier than it had ever been, though Marlowe noticed, with quiet gratitude, that the customers who filled her stools now looked at her differently than they used to, not with suspicion, not with the wary curiosity of strangers wondering what secrets she carried behind her careful smile. With respect, simple, steady, earned. Sheriff Corbett stopped by most evenings now, and Marlowe noticed the particular way his eyes softened when Delphine, who'd decided to stay in Cedar Hollow indefinitely, laughed at something he said from behind the bar. She said nothing about it. Some things needed time to grow on their own. The same patient way an oak tree grows tall enough to shelter 3 generations of nesting birds. Reeve visited once more before returning to whatever quiet, unofficial life awaited him elsewhere, standing on the porch of the rusty anchor one final evening, watching the sun set gold and orange over the hills. You could still come back, you know, he said. There are programs, people who could use someone with your particular training. Your father's daughter, doing his kind of work, properly this time, above board. Marlowe considered it a long moment, watching the light fade slow across the quiet street of the only town she'd ever truly chosen for herself. Maybe someday, she said finally. But not yet. This town needed me to remember who I used to be. Now I think I need to spend some time figuring out who I get to become next, with all of it finally out in the open. Reeve nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile crossing his weathered face. Your father would understand that better than anyone. I know, Marlowe said softly. I think for the first time in 15 years I finally know exactly what he'd think about all of this. That night, after the bar had closed and Delphine had gone home, and Cedar Hollow had settled into its familiar, quiet dark. Marlowe sat alone on the porch steps of the Rusty Anchor, her father's original journal open in her lap, rereading the words that had started everything 3 short weeks earlier. If you're reading this, then you found it, which means I was right about you, which I always was. She closed the journal gently, looking up at a sky full of slow-turning stars above Cedar Hollow, feeling, for the first time in 15 long years, something settle fully and finally into place inside her chest. Not an ending, exactly. Something closer to a beginning that had simply taken 15 years, one viral video, and one very unfortunate slap in a crowded bar to finally, properly begin. Somewhere beyond the tree line, faint and distant, she could have sworn she heard a wren calling out into the settling dark, small and fierce and entirely unafraid, exactly the way her father had always told her a wren should sound, watching, waiting, and finally, after everything, coming home. Bonus story. What the Heart Learns. Second 6 months after the ceremony, on the hill, Cedar Hollow threw its first 4th of July festival the town had seen in years. Because somebody decided the town needed a reason to celebrate something other than survival. Because after everything, after Halloway, after Renner, after 15 years of buried grief finally dragged up into daylight, the whole county seemed to agree, without ever quite saying it out loud, that they were due for a little joy. Marlowe stood behind a folding table outside the Rusty Anchor, pouring lemonade instead of whiskey for once, watching red, white, and blue bunting flutter along Main Street in a breeze that smelled like cut grass and charcoal smoke. Delphine stood beside her, which was still, 6 months later, something Marlowe had to remind herself to believe. Her sister, staying, not visiting, staying, in the small apartment above the old flower shop, having taken over Odette Marsh's business when Odette finally retired that spring. "You're staring," Delphine said, not looking up from the cash box. "I'm not staring. You've been staring at me for a week straight, like I might evaporate." "You might." Delphine rolled her eyes, but there was no heat in it. Just the easy, worn-in affection of two sisters who'd finally, after 15 years apart, found their way back to something that felt almost like childhood again. Almost. Better, in some ways, because this time they'd chosen it. "Speaking of evaporating," Marlowe said, "your sheriff's headed this way." Delphine's spine went straight as a rifle barrel. "He's not my sheriff, sure." "He's not, Marlowe. Sure he's not." Marlowe fought back a smile and mostly lost. "That's why you've rebraided your hair 4 times in the last 10 minutes. I have not." Delphine's hand flew self-consciously to her hair before she caught herself, glaring sideways at her sister with an expression that promised retribution later. Sheriff Nash Corbett crossed the street toward them, out of uniform for once, wearing a plain blue shirt that made him look 10 years younger, and considerably less like a man who'd spent the last 6 months untangling federal paperwork on the largest corruption case Cedar Hollow had ever seen. "Ashcroft sisters," he said, tipping an imaginary hat. "Never seen a lemonade stand guarded so fiercely." "We take our beverages seriously," Marlowe said, clearly. His eyes drifted, not quite subtly enough, toward Delphine. "You planning on staying behind that table all evening? Or is there a chance somebody could talk you into watching the fireworks from somewhere with an actual view?" Delphine's cheeks went the particular shade of pink that had, over the last 6 months, become entirely too familiar to Marlowe. "I have a lemonade stand to run," Delphine said. "I have a deputy standing 4 feet away, doing absolutely nothing," Corbett said. "I could deputize him into lemonade duty. Emergency county ordinance. I have the authority. You do not have that authority. I'm the sheriff. I have all sorts of authority. Nobody's bothered to specify the limits of yet." Marlowe watched this exchange with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent 6 months quietly, patiently waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. Because she remembered the night in the sheriff's office, remembered the way Corbett's hand had found the light switch with hesitation, trusting her completely on nothing but the sound of her voice and the certainty in it, remembered thinking, even in the chaos of that moment, that a man who trusted a near stranger that fast, that fully, was a man worth watching. And she'd watched, all 6 months, watched the way Corbett found reasons to stop by the flower shop that had nothing to do with county business. Watched the way Delphine, who used to fill silences with nervous chatter, had slowly learned to sit comfortably in them instead, whenever the sheriff was nearby. "Go," Marlowe said finally, taking the cash box out of her sister's hands before Delphine could protest further. "I've got the stand. Go watch your fireworks. They're not my fireworks." "Delphine." "What?" "Go." Delphine hesitated one final second, glancing between her sister's knowing expression and the sheriff's carefully patient smile, before finally visibly giving up the fight. "Fine," she said. "But only because Marlowe's making me." "Sure," Corbett said, offering his arm with exaggerated formality. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, Miss Ashcroft." Marlowe watched them walk off together down Main Street, Delphine's laugh drifting back faint and bright over the noise of the festival crowd, and felt something warm settle behind her ribs that had nothing to do with the summer heat, because that was the thing nobody warned you about: grief. How it left room, eventually, for exactly this, for lemonade stands and 4th of July fireworks and a sister's laugh carrying down a street that used to feel, not so long ago, like the last safe place either of them had left in the world. "You did that on purpose," said a voice behind her. Marlowe turned to find her grandfather, Silas, settling into a folding chair beside the table, a paper cup of lemonade already in hand, his cane resting against his knee. "Did what on purpose? Pushed those two together. Don't play innocent with me, girl. I taught your father everything he knew about strategy. And you've got the same look on your face he used to get whenever a plan came together exactly the way he wanted it to." Marlowe laughed, low and easy. "Maybe I just wanted my sister to enjoy her evening." "Maybe," Silas said, sipping his lemonade with a small, knowing smile. "Or maybe you've been watching that sheriff dance around your sister for 6 months and finally ran out of patience." "Guilty," Marlowe admitted. Silas chuckled, the sound rough and warm. And for a while the two of them sat together in comfortable silence, watching the festival crowd move slow and easy up and down Main Street. Children ran between food stalls with sparklers not yet lit. Somebody's dog barked twice at a firework testing itself early, then settled back down in the shade. The whole town, Marlowe thought, looked exactly the way a town was supposed to look on a summer evening. Whole, unhurried, safe. It hadn't always felt that way. Not for a long time. "You've been quiet about it," Silas said eventually, "but I know today's not just about fireworks for you." Marlowe's smile faded slightly. "It's been almost a year since the video. I know. Sometimes I still can't believe how fast it all happened. One night. One stupid decision by some drunk man's son, and suddenly everything I'd buried for 3 years came right back up to the surface." She looked down at her hands, remembering the weight of the metal case beneath the oak tree, the sound of her father's letter trembling in her fingers. "I used to be so angry that his choices took him away from us. Now I understand it better. I still wish it different. But I understand it." Silas was quiet a moment, watching the crowd, watching the flags snapping gentle in the evening breeze. "Your father used to say something to me," he said finally, "back before you were even born. Said the hardest part of service wasn't the danger. It was knowing that doing right by strangers sometimes meant doing wrong by the people who loved you most. He carried that weight his whole life, Marlowe. I don't think he ever fully forgave himself for it, even in the years he had left." "I wish I could tell him it's okay now," Marlowe said quietly. "That we understood eventually. That we're okay." "Maybe he knows," Silas said. "Maybe that's what all this is. A daughter who finished what he started. A family put back together instead of scattered by grief. A sister who came home. Seems to me a man like your father would call that a fair enough ending to a story he never got to finish writing himself." Marlowe looked out at the crowd, at the string lights just beginning to glow gold against the darkening sky, at her sister's silhouette laughing beside Sheriff Corbett near the edge of the crowd, waiting for fireworks that hadn't started yet. "I like to think so," she said softly. The first firework cracked open across the sky a few minutes later, a burst of gold unraveling slow against deep blue dusk. and the whole town tilted its heads back in unison. The particular hush that falls over a crowd right before wonder takes hold of it completely. Marlowe watched the light bloom and fade, thinking of birds' nests hidden in old oak trees, of letters written 3 days before an ending nobody saw coming, of a 15-year silence finally, fully broken. Somewhere in the crowd, she heard Delphine laugh again, brighter this time, and beneath the laughter, quiet enough that maybe only Marlowe would have noticed it. Sheriff Corbett's voice, low and warm, murmuring something that made her sister go still for exactly one heartbeat before she smiled and leaned just slightly closer. Marlowe smiled to herself, alone at the lemonade table, watching fireworks paint gold and red across a sky that had once, not so long ago, felt entirely too heavy to hold anything as light and simple as joy. Little Wren, she whispered to herself, the old nickname settling warm and familiar in her chest, instead of aching the way it used to. I think we finally made it home. Above Cedar Hollow, the fireworks kept climbing, one after another, bright against the settling dark, and the whole town watched together, whole and unafraid, exactly the way her father had always hoped, somewhere in his heart, that his daughters might someday learn to be. The rusty anchor stayed open late that night, the whole town spilling in afterward for one final round before the festival wound down. And Marlowe stood behind her own bar again, pouring drinks for neighbors who no longer looked at her like a stranger, hiding secrets behind a careful smile. Just a woman. Home, finally, in every sense the word could hold. And when Delphine came through the door near midnight, cheeks still flushed, hands still loosely tangled with Sheriff Corbett's, Marlowe simply raised an eyebrow, said nothing at all, and poured her sister a celebratory glass of the good whiskey, the kind reserved for nights that mattered. Some stories, she thought, watching her sister's quiet, unguarded happiness settle across the room like warm light. Some stories didn't end with fireworks or federal arrests or graveside confessions. Some of them simply ended, gently, the way a wren finally settles into a nest built patient and slow, one careful branch at a time after 15 long years of learning exactly where home was always meant to be.